Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia. His life began in hardship. His father, a soldier in the Colombian army, was killed before Pedro was even born. His mother, Benilda Lopez, was left to raise her children alone, working as a prostitute in the small town where they lived. The house was chaotic, loud, and full of tension. There was no structure, no safety, and no gentle hand to guide the boy as he grew. From his earliest years, Pedro learned about neglect, rejection, and violence. By the age of 8, his life took a decisive turn. His mother caught him touching one of his sisters, and instead of discipline or protection, she forced him out of the house. Alone, Pedro was abandoned to the streets of Bogota. The streets of Colombia's capital were unforgiving. He joined groups of homeless children who survived by stealing, scavenging, and fighting over scraps of food. It was during this time that he encountered the darker side of humanity again. An older man lured him into an abandoned building with promises of shelter, only to assault him. This trauma deepened the growing fracture in Lopez's young mind. As the years passed, Lopez drifted. He survived by stealing cars, joining gangs, and wandering through Colombia's cities. For a brief moment, it seemed he might find a way out. An American family took him in, offering food, shelter, and schooling. But Pedro couldn't adjust to this unfamiliar kindness. He ran away, slipping back into the life of a drifter, disconnected from stability. By the time he reached his 20s, Lopez had crossed into Peru. Here, his transformation into a predator began. He sought out young girls, mostly from indigenous communities where poverty was widespread and children were often left unattended. His victims were usually between the ages of 8 and 12. Lopez developed a method that he would repeat again and again. He would approach the child, speak kindly, gain her trust, and lure her away from the safety of her home. Once they were isolated, he assaulted them and then strangled them. He later admitted that he preferred strangulation because it allowed him to look into his victims' eyes as they died. The killings in Peru went largely unnoticed at first. The victims came from communities with little connection to police or the media. Parents reported their daughters missing, but few investigations followed. Lopez continued, confident in his ability to operate without consequence. But in one village, his pattern caught up with him. After attempting to abduct a girl, Lopez was captured by members of an indigenous community. They tied him up, beat him, and prepared to execute him. For once, it seemed his crimes would come to an end. But an American missionary working in the area intervened. She pleaded with the villagers to spare him, urging them to hand him over to the police instead. They relented, and Pedro Lopez was deported back to Colombia. That act of mercy, though well-intentioned, unleashed a far greater tragedy. Back in Colombia, Lopez resumed his crimes. He traveled constantly, drifting between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. In Ecuador especially, children began disappearing at an alarming rate in the late 1970s. Dozens of girls vanished from markets, schools, and rural roadsides. Their disappearances were often dismissed as runaways or trafficking victims. Poor families had little power to demand answers, and the police were overwhelmed. Lopez exploited these gaps perfectly. He later admitted that at the peak of his spree, he was killing 3 children a week. In 1980, his killing spree finally began to unravel. In the city of Ambato, Ecuador, a 12-year-old girl went missing from a crowded market. Police began investigating, and suspicion eventually fell on Lopez. Witnesses had seen him loitering around the market, watching children. He was arrested while attempting another abduction. Once in custody, Lopez surprised investigators with his openness. Calmly, almost proudly, he confessed to his crimes. What horrified authorities was not just his confession, but its scale. Lopez admitted to killing more than 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Investigators followed him to mass graves where he had buried dozens of victims. Shallow pits in the dry earth revealed the small remains of children, confirming at least part of his monstrous claim. Ecuadorian authorities could only charge him with 57 murders, the number they could directly link to him. In 1983, He was convicted and sentenced. But Ecuador's legal system had strict limits. At the time, the maximum prison sentence was only 16 years. Even for one of history's most prolific serial killers, the law would not allow more. Lopez served 14 years before being released in 1994 for good behavior. Instead of freedom, he was deported to Colombia, where he was immediately arrested again, this time in connection with a 1988 murder. But the system failed once more. He was declared insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. In 1998, doctors declared him sane, and he was released on bail for just $50. After that, Pedro Lopez disappeared. His exact whereabouts remain unknown. Some reports suggest he returned to Colombia and vanished into obscurity. Others claim he may have died, though no official confirmation has ever been given. Interpol later issued a warrant for his arrest, but no new charges have ever been successfully brought against him. Pedro Lopez remains a figure of chilling notoriety. His estimated death toll of more than 300 makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Yet his time behind bars was shockingly short. The combination of weak laws, missed opportunities, and systemic failures allowed him to walk free after taking countless lives. The legacy of Lopez is not just the horror of his actions, but the silence surrounding them. Many of his victims came from poor indigenous communities whose voices were rarely heard, whose grief was often ignored. Families were left without answers, their daughters gone forever, their pain buried along with the bodies in shallow graves. The story of Pedro Lopez is one of cruelty, neglect, and injustice. A boy cast out into the streets grew into a man who preyed on the most vulnerable. A system that might have stopped him failed at every step. And a killer who confessed to hundreds of murders walked free into the world once more. The monster of the Andes fades into the shadows of history, but the silence he left behind speaks loudly. His story remains one of the darkest in true crime, a grim reminder of how much can be lost when society looks away. Next story. Otis Elwood Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. His childhood was steeped in poverty, abuse, and instability. From the very beginning, he lived on the margins of society, and his home was far from a safe place. His father abandoned the family when Otis was young, leaving him in the care of his mother, grandmother, and other relatives, many of whom inflicted cruelty upon him. His mother was a strict and often violent woman who dressed him in girls' clothing to humiliate him and called him names meant to break his spirit. His grandmother practiced forms of spiritualism and witchcraft, instilling in Otis a warped sense of fear and fascination with the supernatural. From a young age, Toole displayed troubling behavior. He was slow in school, struggling with both learning difficulties and epilepsy. He often had seizures and was taunted by other children for being different. By his own later accounts, he was sexually abused by multiple family members and neighbors. This environment of abuse and neglect shaped him into someone detached from normal human connections, someone who would later drift toward violence without remorse. As a teenager, Toole spent more time on the streets than at home. He began running away frequently, hitchhiking across states, surviving through odd jobs, theft, and occasional prostitution. His sexuality made him a target for more ridicule and rejection. He identified as gay, but lived in an era and place where acceptance was almost impossible. He would later claim that he was drawn to fire, fascinated by watching things burn, and soon became known in his community as a pyromaniac. Neighbors recalled how he seemed mesmerized by flames, often lingering at the scenes of small fires. It was also during his teenage years that Toole claimed to have committed his first murder. He said he killed a traveling salesman who had propositioned him, striking the man with a car and leaving him for dead. Whether this account was true is uncertain, but it was the first of many confessions Toole would later make, weaving fact and fiction together in a way that often left investigators unsure what to believe. By the 1970s, Otis Toole was a full drifter. He had no permanent home, no steady work, and no ties to keep him in one place. It was during this period that he met Henry Lee Lucas, a man whose life had followed a similarly destructive path. The two formed a partnership that would become notorious in the world of true crime. Both men had been raised in abusive households. Both had spent their lives drifting across the American South, and both claimed to share a taste for violence. Together, Lucas and Toole fed off one another's darkest impulses. They traveled across states, taking odd jobs, stealing cars, and, according to their own confessions, killing along the way. The true number of their victims has never been fully established. At various times, Lucas and Toole confessed to hundreds of murders, but many of those claims were later disproven or dismissed as fabrications. Still, authorities believe that at least some of their confessions were real, and the pair were undoubtedly responsible for a series of killings during their years together. Toole's crimes were marked by randomness and brutality. Unlike serial killers who followed a strict pattern, Toole often acted on impulse, targeting strangers he encountered while drifting. He claimed to have cannibalized some of his victims, a claim that horrified the public, though investigators could not always confirm it. His fascination with fire continued, and he admitted to setting numerous buildings ablaze simply to watch them burn. One of the most infamous cases connected to Otis Toole was the murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh in 1981. Adam, the son of John Walsh, who later became the host of America's Most Wanted, was abducted from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. His severed head was found 2 weeks later in a drainage canal. For decades, the case remained unsolved, haunting the nation. Toole eventually confessed to Adam's abduction and murder, though the evidence was inconclusive. In 2008, long after Toole's death, police officially closed the case, declaring him the killer based on his confessions and circumstantial evidence. Despite the sensational nature of his crimes, Otis Toole's life was largely one of chaos, drifting, and confinement. He spent much of his adult life in and out of prison, arrested for arson, theft, and violent crimes. His confessions were often contradictory. He would admit to murders in one breath, then recant in the next. Investigators struggled to separate truth from lies, but his name remained tied to some of the darkest chapters of late 20th century crime in America. In 1983, Toole was arrested for an unrelated arson in Jacksonville. While in custody, he confessed to several murders, some with Henry Lee Lucas and some on his own. Over time, he would be convicted of 6 killings, though he claimed responsibility for many more. Authorities suspected that he exaggerated his role in certain cases for attention, but they also believed that he was genuinely guilty of several murders for which there was no clear evidence. As the years passed, Otis Toole's health began to deteriorate. He contracted AIDS in prison and grew increasingly frail. In September 1996, he died in prison at the age of 49. At the time of his death, he was serving multiple life sentences for murder, with the official tally of his victims still uncertain. The legacy of Otis Toole is one of confusion, horror, and unanswered questions. Alongside Henry Lee Lucas, he painted himself as part of a deadly duo responsible for hundreds of killings across the United States. While many of those claims were disproven, the crimes they did commit were enough to mark them as two of the most disturbing drifters in modern history. Otis Toole's story reflects the bleak path of a life shaped by abuse, neglect, and violence. From a childhood filled with trauma, he grew into a man who inflicted trauma on others. His name remains tied to some of the most notorious unsolved murders of his time, and his partnership with Henry Lee Lucas stands as a grim reminder of how two broken lives can fuse into something darker. In the end, Toole died behind bars, his confessions still clouded in uncertainty, his true number of victims never fully known. What is certain is that he left a trail of destruction in his wake, a life spent drifting from place to place, leaving pain and fire behind him. Next story. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in the small rural community of Blacksburg, Virginia. His childhood was marked by extreme poverty, violence, and neglect. His father, Anderson Lucas, was a World War I veteran who had lost both legs in a workplace accident, leaving him dependent on others for mobility. His mother, Viola, was described as domineering, abusive, and cruel. She controlled the household with an iron hand, and young Henry bore the brunt of her harshness. Henry's earliest years were filled with trauma. His mother was a sex worker who often brought clients into their home. She forced Henry to watch, humiliating him, and sometimes dressed him in girls' clothing as punishment. Neighbors later recalled that Viola beat her son mercilessly, sometimes until he bled, and withheld affection from him. His father, unable to defend him, drowned his pain in alcohol. The family lived in a small shack without electricity, and Henry grew up without any sense of safety or warmth. By the time he reached school age, Henry was already considered different. He suffered from poor eyesight, the result of severe infection that left one eye permanently damaged. He was bullied by classmates and fell behind in his studies. A report from his youth described him as slow, unkempt, and socially isolated. By his teenage years, he was illiterate and deeply scarred by the violence of his home. At the age of 13, Henry ran away. He drifted across the American South, surviving on odd jobs, theft, and petty crime. His criminal record began early with arrests for burglary and car theft. In 1951, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for burglary. Behind bars, he found no reform, only further detachment from the world outside. When he was released, his life spiraled further. In 1960, he committed his first known murder. During an argument with his mother, Henry snapped. Viola had constantly berated him, and that night, he attacked her. He stabbed her in the neck and left her die. It was a brutal killing, and though he initially fled, he was later arrested. For this crime, he was sentenced to serve between 20 and 40 years in prison. After only 10 years, however, he was released in 1970 due to prison overcrowding and good behavior. Freedom did not bring stability. Henry drifted again, moving through the South and Midwest, often surviving on the margins. His crimes escalated. He was arrested for attempted kidnapping and again spent time in prison. When released in 1975, he fell into the company of Otis Toole, a drifter like himself. The two men formed a grim partnership, roaming across states together, stealing cars, breaking into houses, and, according to their confessions, committing murders. Henry and Otis fed off one another's instability. They traveled with Toole's young niece, Becky Powell, who became close to Henry. In the late 1970s, Henry settled with Becky in Texas, where their relationship blurred the lines between family and intimacy. She was only a teenager, but Henry treated her as both a companion and a lover. When Becky eventually expressed a desire to return home, Henry killed her, stabbing her and disposing of her body. He later confessed to this murder, one of the few that authorities believed beyond doubt. In 1983, Henry was arrested in Texas for possession of a firearm, a violation of his parole. Once in custody, he began to talk. What followed shocked investigators and captivated the nation. Henry began confessing to murders, not just one or two, but hundreds. He calmly told police that he had killed more than 600 people across nearly every state in America. His confessions included hitchhikers, sex workers, strangers he claimed to have met in bars, and even children. Law enforcement agencies from across the country rushed to interview him, eager to close their unsolved cases. For a time, Henry became the center of a media frenzy, hailed as the most prolific serial killer in history. He was flown from state to state, questioned by police, and taken to crime scenes where he would point out details. Newspapers ran headlines of a drifter who had killed more people than anyone else in America. But over time, doubts began to grow. Henry's confessions often contradicted known facts. He claimed to be in two places hundreds of miles apart at the same time. Some murders he described involved details that were incorrect or impossible. It became clear that many of his confessions were false. Investigators realized that Henry was confessing to crimes he could not have committed. Why he did so remains debated. Some believe Henry craved attention after a lifetime of neglect. Others suggest he enjoyed the special treatment, the meals, the travel, the notoriety that came with being a supposed super killer. Police, eager to close cases, may have encouraged his stories, willingly overlooking inconsistencies. The phenomenon became known as the Lucas hoax. Despite the false confessions, Henry was still guilty of several murders. He was convicted of 11 homicides, including that of Becky Powell and an elderly woman named Kate Rich. In 1984, he was sentenced to death for the murder of an unidentified woman, later nicknamed Orange Socks for the clothing she wore when found. For years, he sat on death row in Texas. In 1998, then Governor George W. Bush commuted his death sentence to life in prison. The decision was unusual, as Bush rarely granted clemency. The commutation came after doubts were raised about Henry's confession in the Orange Socks case. While many believed Henry had killed, there was enough uncertainty in that specific case to spare his life. Henry Lee Lucas spent the remainder of his days behind bars. He died in prison on March 13, 2001, at the age of 64. The official cause was heart failure. The legacy of Henry Lee Lucas is complex. On one hand, he was undoubtedly a murderer, responsible for the deaths of several people, including his own mother, his companion Becky Powell, and others. On the other hand, his hundreds of false confessions misled investigators, closed cases prematurely, and caused enormous pain for families seeking the truth about their loved ones. His story is often cited as an example of how law enforcement can be misled by unreliable confessions, especially when combined with the pressure to solve unsolved murders. His life reflects the tragic path of a man born into violence and neglect, who became both a real killer and a symbol of deception in the world of true crime. In the quiet of his final years, Henry faded into obscurity, but the shadow of his name lingers, remembered not only for the lives he took, but for the countless lives disrupted by his lies. Next story. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in Judenburg, a small town in Austria. His life began in instability. His mother, Teresa, was a barmaid who worked in difficult circumstances, and his father was an American soldier whom Jack never knew. His mother was arrested when he was just 2 years old, and Jack was sent to live with his grandfather, a man known for his drinking and violent temper. The boy grew up in a rough household where crime and abuse were never far away. From an early age, Unterweger drifted into trouble. He stole, fought, and skipped school. His teenage years were spent on the streets, stealing cars, breaking into homes, and drifting from one crime to the next. By the time he was in his 20s, he had accumulated a long criminal record for theft and assault. But beneath the surface of petty crime, darker tendencies were forming. In 1974, those tendencies erupted into murder. That year, Unterweger picked up an 18-year-old German woman named Margaret Schaefer. He assaulted her, then strangled her with her own bra. He left her body in the woods, hidden but not far from a rural road. It was a shocking crime, brutal in its intimacy. Police soon caught him, and in 1976, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. What followed seemed, at first, to be a transformation. Behind bars, Unterweger began writing. He produced poems, short stories, and eventually an autobiography titled Purgatory, or The Trip to Jail. Report of a Guilty Man, the book, described his troubled childhood, his feelings of guilt, and his supposed desire for redemption. Austrian intellectuals and artists were captivated. They praised his writing as raw and authentic, a cry from a man who had changed. Campaigns began calling for his release. They argued that Unterweger was rehabilitated, that he had turned his life around through literature. Prominent figures supported him, believing his case symbolized the potential for reform in the justice system. Against the advice of prison officials who had warned that Unterweger remained manipulative and dangerous, the campaign succeeded. In 1990, after serving just 15 years, Jack Unterweger was released on parole. Freedom brought him celebrity. He became a media figure in Austria, hosting television shows, giving interviews, and writing articles. He was invited to schools and universities to speak about prison reform and rehabilitation. To the public, he was the model of a man redeemed, a former criminal who had transformed into a writer and advocate. But beneath the polished image, Unterweger had not changed. Within months of his release, women began disappearing. Most of his victims were sex workers, women who lived on the margins of society. His method was chillingly consistent. He would pick them up, assault them, and then strangle them with their own bras, just as he had done with his first known victim years earlier. The murders began in Austria, but soon stretched beyond. In 1991, Unterweger traveled to Los Angeles, supposedly on assignment as a journalist writing about crime in America. While there, several sex workers were murdered, all killed in the same manner as those in Austria. Authorities later concluded that Unterweger was responsible for these deaths as well. For months, police in Austria, Germany, and the United States investigated the series of killings. Patterns emerged and suspicions grew. Unterweger, once celebrated as a symbol of reform, was now the prime suspect in a string of brutal murders. In 1992, the evidence became overwhelming. Austrian police issued a warrant for his arrest. But Unterweger fled, traveling to France and then to the United States. He was eventually captured in Miami, Florida, by U.S. Marshals and extradited back to Austria to stand trial. His trial in 1994 was one of the most sensational in Austrian history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious spectators. Unterweger, ever the manipulator, dressed neatly, spoke calmly, and tried to charm the court. But the evidence spoke louder. Fiber analysis linked him to the crime scenes. Witnesses described his movements. The pattern of his killings, women strangled with their own bras, was undeniable. In June 1994, Jack Unterweger was convicted of 9 murders in Austria and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He faced the reality of returning to prison, this time with no hope of release. That night, in his cell, Unterweger took his own life. He fashioned a noose from the cord of his prison trousers and hanged himself, a final act of control over his fate. The legacy of Jack Unterweger is one of deception. He convinced the nation that he had reformed, gaining fame and admiration, only to use his freedom to kill again. His story is often cited as a cautionary tale of misplaced trust, a reminder that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Unterweger remains one of Austria's most notorious criminals. His life is studied not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the way he manipulated society, blending the mask of a writer and intellectual with the reality of a predator. For the families of his victims, his celebrated release was not a story of redemption, but a failure of justice that cost lives. And so, Jack Unterweger's name lives on as the man who fooled the world, a killer who used words to disguise the truth, and whose final act closed the chapter of a life built on lies and violence. Next story. Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in Hindenburg, Upper Silesia, which is now part of Poland. He was the 6th child of a poor miner's family. His early life was shaped by war, poverty, and neglect. During World War II, when Joachim was still a boy, his father was drafted into the German army and taken prisoner by the Soviets. The family struggled with hunger and instability, moving frequently. Joachim grew up small, timid, and deeply isolated. He had developmental delays that left him behind other children. Teachers and neighbors noticed his limited intelligence, his awkward mannerisms, and his inability to connect. He wet the bed well into adolescence, was bullied by peers, and spent much of his time wandering alone. He was fascinated by animals, but even this interest took a dark turn. He began killing cats and other small creatures, strangling them, sometimes cutting them open to see what was inside. This early cruelty went unnoticed by adults, written off as odd behavior from a backward boy. By the time Kroll reached adulthood, his mind had settled into a pattern of loneliness, frustration, and violent fantasy. He worked menial jobs as a farmhand, a laborer, and eventually at a factory in Duisburg. Colleagues thought him strange, but harmless. He was quiet, kept to himself, and avoided conversation. But inside, he was developing urges he could not control. He was haunted by sexual frustration, unable to form relationships, and consumed by fantasies of domination and violence. In 1955, at the age of 22, those fantasies erupted into his first murder. He encountered a 19-year-old girl named Irmgard Strell in the Rhine meadows near Duisburg. He strangled her, violated her corpse, and stabbed her repeatedly. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. Sudden attacks on unsuspecting victims, sexual assault, and often acts of mutilation. Police had no suspect and chalked the crime up as an isolated tragedy. 3 years later, in 1958, Kroll killed again. His victim was a 12-year-old girl named Clara Frieda Tesmer. She had been walking alone when Kroll lured her to a secluded spot, strangled her, and assaulted her. In a twist of tragic injustice, police wrongly accused an innocent man of the crime. He confessed under pressure, later retracting, but was still convicted and served time in prison. Kroll's ability to fade into the background meant he remained undetected. By the early 1960s, Kroll's murders became more frequent. In 1959, he killed 24-year-old Manuela Note. He strangled her and then mutilated her body with a knife, removing pieces of flesh. It was around this time that Kroll developed a disturbing habit that earned him the title that would terrify Germany years later, the Ruhr Cannibal. After killing, he sometimes cut pieces of flesh from his victims and took them home. He would cook the flesh, mixing it with potatoes or stew. Later, he told police that he did this not because of a ritual, but because meat was expensive. In 1962, he murdered 12-year-old Petra Gysi. He strangled her and then mutilated her corpse. Police once again had no leads. In 1965, he killed 25-year-old Monica Taffel. The investigation misfired again when another man was accused. Kroll's ability to strike at random, across different towns and districts, prevented detectives from linking the crimes. Between 1955 and 1976, Kroll murdered at least 14 people, though he claimed the number was higher. His victims ranged from young girls to adult women, all strangled, many mutilated. Each crime scene bore his mark: sudden violence, sexual assault, and in some cases, missing body parts later found cooked in his flat. Kroll's final crime, the one that ended his spree, came in July 1976. His last victim was 4-year-old Marion Ketter. She disappeared while playing near her home in Duisburg. A frantic search began. Neighbors noticed strange plumbing issues in their apartment block. Toilets were backing up. When police investigated, they found something horrifying. In the pipes, human remains had clogged the system. Tracing the plumbing led them directly to Joachim Kroll's apartment. Inside, detectives found a scene of horror. Pots were on the stove, containing stew mixed with human flesh. In the refrigerator were more remains. Kroll confessed immediately. He told police that he had strangled Marion, dismembered her, and attempted to flush parts of her body down the toilet. During questioning, Kroll calmly admitted to a string of murders spanning over 2 decades. He listed victims by name, describing how he had killed them and what he had done afterward. His flat, a modest, shabby space, became infamous as the home of one of Germany's worst killers. Kroll was arrested and put on trial in 1982, years after his capture. The trial lasted 151 days. Psychiatrists examined him and determined that while he was intellectually limited with the mind of a child, he knew right from wrong. The court rejected pleas of diminished responsibility. In April 1982, Joachim Kroll was found guilty of 8 murders and 1 attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, he lived quietly, showing little understanding of the enormity of his crimes. Other inmates despised him, and he spent much of his time alone. In 1991, at the age of 58, Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack behind bars. His story remains one of the most chilling in German history. A man of low intelligence, seemingly harmless on the outside, who spent decades killing in silence, evading capture through randomness and luck, and horrifying the nation when his full crimes were revealed. Next story. Mark Dutroux was born on November 6, 1956, in Brussels, Belgium. He was the eldest of 5 children in a troubled household. His parents, both teachers, struggled with their own relationship, and the family atmosphere was tense, cold, and unstable. When Mark was still young, his parents divorced, and his childhood became fractured between two unhappy homes. From an early age, Dutrix showed signs of cruelty and manipulation. He was known to bully other children and displayed a lack of empathy that went unnoticed by those around him. As he grew older, Dutrix's behavior turned criminal. In his teenage years, he ran away from home repeatedly, stealing cars, dealing in stolen goods, and committing petty crimes. He often manipulated girls into trusting him, only to abuse that trust. By his 20s, his criminal record included theft, assault, and fraud. He married young, fathered children, and divorced just as quickly, leaving a trail of instability and neglect. In 1986, Belgian authorities finally recognized Dutrix's true danger. He was arrested for abducting and assaulting several young girls. The crimes were chilling, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Yet, astonishingly, after serving only about 3 years, he was released early for good behavior. This decision would later haunt Belgium, because it freed a man who would go on to commit some of the most horrific crimes in the country's history. In the 1990s, Dutrix began building a twisted empire of abuse. He purchased several properties across Belgium, rundown houses, and hidden cellars that he converted into secret chambers. With the help of his accomplice and partner, Michel Martin, he abducted young girls, imprisoning them in these basements. He kept them locked away for weeks, sometimes months, subjecting them to starvation, neglect, and abuse. In 1995, two 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, disappeared while walking home in the town of Grace Holland. Their disappearance shocked Belgium, sparking nationwide searches. But the girls had been taken by Dutrix, imprisoned in one of his cellars. When Dutrix was briefly jailed for unrelated theft later that year, he left the girls in the hidden chamber without food. By the time he returned, both children had died of starvation. Not long after, two more young girls, Marshall and Yves Lambrex, aged 17 and 19, were kidnapped while on holiday in Ostend. Their fate was the same: imprisoned, abused, and ultimately murdered. In 1996, another two victims, Sabine Dardenne, age 12, and Letitia Delhez, age 14, were abducted. But unlike the earlier girls, Sabine and Letitia survived. Their eventual rescue would break open the case. In August 1996, police searching Dutrix's home discovered Letitia alive, imprisoned in a hidden cell. Days later, they also found Sabine. Their testimony exposed the full horror of what Dutrix had done. Authorities then uncovered the bodies of Julie, Melissa, and Yves buried on his properties. The revelations horrified Belgium. Citizens were outraged not only by Dutrix's crimes, but by the failures of police and justice. Complaints had been filed against him repeatedly over the years, and yet authorities had failed to act. Worse still, many suspected that Dutrix had not acted alone, that he was part of a larger network of child exploitation, possibly protected by powerful figures. Whether or not those suspicions were true, they fueled a wave of public anger and distrust. In October 1996, 500,000 people marched through Brussels in what became known as the White March, a demonstration demanding justice, accountability, and protection for children. It was one of the largest public protests in Belgium's history, a symbol of national grief and rage. Dutrix was tried in 2004 after years of investigation and delay. The trial was enormous, lasting months, with survivors Sabine and Letitia testifying against him. The evidence left no doubt. Dutrix was convicted of kidnapping, rape, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. His accomplice, Michel Martin, received 30 years, though her later early release caused new waves of public anger. In prison, Dutrix remained manipulative, claiming he was the victim of conspiracies, blaming others, and never accepting responsibility. But to the people of Belgium, his name became synonymous with betrayal and horror. The case left deep scars on the nation. It exposed the failings of the justice system, the incompetence of law enforcement, and the vulnerability of children in a society that had trusted its institutions. For the families of the victims, no sentence could undo the suffering. For the survivors, The memories of their captivity remained lifelong wounds. Marc Dutroux will forever be remembered as Belgium's most hated criminal, a man who turned his cunning into cruelty and whose crimes shattered a nation's trust. In the summer of 1969, the city of Los Angeles was simmering under the weight of change. The counterculture of the 60s had reached its peak. Young people were questioning authority, turning to new ways of life, and searching for belonging in communes and spiritual groups. Against this backdrop, a man named Charles Manson rose from obscurity to infamy. His story and the crimes carried out by the group around him would come to define the end of the 60s. The murders committed by his followers shocked not only California, but the entire world, and their echoes continue to this day. Charles Manson was born in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 when she gave birth to him. His father was absent from the start, and Manson's childhood was marked by instability and neglect. His mother spent time in prison, and young Charles was shuttled between relatives and institutions. By the age of 12, he was already stealing and running away from home. Reform schools became a revolving door for him, and each stay seemed to harden him further. He learned how to manipulate people and how to survive by reading others' weaknesses. By his 20s, Manson had spent more time in prison than out of it. He developed a talent for playing guitar and singing. In prison, he absorbed ideas from self-help books and religious tracts, twisting them into his own philosophy. He read about Scientology, about the power of positive thinking, and about Dale Carnegie's methods of influence. He learned how to talk in circles, to use repetition and rhythm to capture attention. When he was finally released from prison in 1967, he arrived in San Francisco at the very height of the Summer of Love. Thousands of young people had flocked to the Haight-Ashbury district, disillusioned with mainstream society and searching for meaning. Manson found in them an audience willing to listen. He began to gather followers, most of them young women. Many came from troubled homes or were searching for belonging. They were drawn in by Manson's charisma, his promises of love, freedom, and a new way of life. He offered them music, drugs, and the illusion of family. They began calling him Charlie and looking to him for guidance. Over time, this group came to be known as the Family. They traveled together, lived communally, and revolved entirely around Manson's desires. Manson's ambitions went beyond being a leader of a small group. He wanted fame as a musician. He believed his songs could change the world. Through connections, he managed to meet record producer Terry Melcher, who was the son of actress Doris Day. Manson played his music for Melcher, hoping to secure a recording contract. For a time, it seemed possible, as Melcher visited the house where the family was living. But eventually, Melcher declined to sign him. For Manson, this rejection was more than a disappointment. It became a seed of resentment and rage. By 1968, Manson had developed a strange philosophy that combined fragments of religion, music lyrics, and apocalyptic visions. He interpreted songs by the Beatles as messages directed at him. In particular, he fixated on the White Album, hearing in its songs a prophecy of a coming race war. He called this vision Helter Skelter, after the Beatles track. In his view, society was about to collapse in chaos and violence, and he and his family would emerge as the rulers of a new order. His followers accepted this vision, partly because they were under the influence of drugs, partly because of their devotion to him, and partly because they had severed ties with the outside world. The family eventually moved to Spahn Ranch, an old movie set location in the hills outside Los Angeles. The ranch was owned by George Spahn, an elderly man nearly blind. Manson convinced him to let them stay in exchange for labor and companionship. The ranch became their home base, where they lived in a haze of drugs, sex, and preparation for what they thought was an inevitable conflict. Life there was chaotic, but tightly controlled by Manson. He would hold long, rambling lectures, play music, and demand loyalty. Tensions escalated in the summer of 1969. One of Manson's close associates, Tex Watson, became deeply involved in his teachings. Watson had once been a clean-cut young man from Texas, but under Manson's sway, he transformed into one of his most devoted soldiers. Another member, Susan Atkins, had grown up in a broken home and drifted into drugs and stripping before finding the family. Patricia Krenwinkel was shy and insecure, easily manipulated by Manson. Leslie Van Houten, only 19, joined later and was drawn by promises of love and belonging. Together with others, they became the core of the family who would carry out Manson's dark commands. In July 1969, a musician named Gary Hinman was killed. Manson believed Hinman had cheated members of the family in a drug deal. Several followers, including Bobby Beausoleil, Susan Atkins, and Mary Brunner, went to Hinman's house to confront him. The confrontation turned violent. Hinman was held for days and eventually stabbed to death. On the walls of his home, the killers scrawled words in blood, including the phrase "political piggy." This was meant to make the murder look like the work of revolutionary groups. It was the beginning of the family's violent campaign. A few weeks later, Manson decided to escalate. On the night of August 8, 1969, he instructed Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to go to a house in Benedict Canyon. This house had once been rented by Terry Melcher, the producer who had rejected Manson. By that summer, it was occupied by actress Sharon Tate, the wife of director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe. Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. She was staying with friends Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski. That night, they became targets not for who they were, but for where they lived. The killers entered the property late at night. What followed was a night of unspeakable violence. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed. Abigail Folger tried to escape, but was chased down and killed. Wojciech Frykowski fought desperately, but was overpowered. Sharon Tate, pleading for the life of her unborn child, was brutally murdered. Before leaving, the killers wrote the word pig on the front door in blood. The next night, Manson himself joined the group as they set out again. This time their targets were Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple who lived in Los Feliz. Manson tied them up and then left, ordering his followers to finish the job. The LaBiancas were stabbed dozens of times. Words like "death to pigs" and "helter skelter" were scrawled on the walls. The murders terrified Los Angeles. Wealthy neighborhoods were gripped with fear. Newspapers carried lurid headlines about ritualistic killings and satanic cults. At first, the police struggled to connect the dots. The Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were investigated separately. Rumors swirled, and Hollywood was on edge. It was only later, through the arrest of Susan Atkins on unrelated charges, that the truth began to surface. While in jail, Atkins spoke to fellow inmates and bragged about the murders. Word reached the authorities, who began to piece together the story. Detectives soon realized that a commune at Spawn Ranch was at the center of it all. A raid on the ranch uncovered weapons, stolen cars, and evidence linking members to the crimes. As the investigation tightened, members of the family were arrested. Charles Manson was taken into custody along with Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. The trial that followed became one of the most notorious in American history. The prosecution was led by Vincent Bugliosi, who faced the challenge of proving that Manson himself had orchestrated the murders, even though he had not wielded the knife in most cases. Bugliosi argued that Manson's control over his followers was so complete that his words were as deadly as any weapon. The prosecution presented testimony from family members who had turned against Manson, including Linda Kasabian, who described the nights of the murders in chilling detail. The defense attempted to portray Manson as a scapegoat, and at times the courtroom descended into chaos. Manson carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika. His followers in the gallery mimicked his gestures, shaved their heads, and chanted in unison. The trial became a media circus, a grim spectacle that mirrored the madness of the crimes themselves. In 1971, Manson and his co-defendants were found guilty. They were sentenced to death. The sentences were later commuted to life in prison after California temporarily abolished the death penalty. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, continuing to attract attention, interviews, and even admirers. He never expressed remorse. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten remain incarcerated to this day, though Van Houten was recently granted parole after decades behind bars. Tex Watson also remains in prison. The impact of the Manson murders went far beyond the courtroom. For many Americans, the killings marked the end of the 60s, shattering the image of peace and love. The randomness of the victims, the brutality of the crimes, and the bizarre philosophy behind them left scars on the cultural landscape. Sharon Tate, remembered for her beauty and promise, became a symbol of lives cut short by senseless violence. In the years that followed, countless books, films, and documentaries would revisit the case. Each attempt tried to make sense of how a drifter like Manson could hold such sway over others, and how ordinary young people could commit acts of such cruelty. The story continues to fascinate and horrify, a reminder of the darkness that can grow in the shadows of charisma and manipulation. And so the tale of Charles Manson and the family remains one of the most infamous true crime stories in history. It is a story that begins with a broken child in Ohio and ends with blood on the walls of Hollywood mansions. It is a story of manipulation, delusion, and murder. It is also a story of how fragile society can feel when violence erupts without reason. Long after the headlines have faded, the echo of those summer nights in 1969 still lingers, reminding us of the depths human beings can fall into when guided by obsession and fear. Next story. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29th of 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. From the moment of her birth, her life was marked by instability and hardship. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted sex offender who was imprisoned at the time of her birth. He later died by suicide in prison. Her mother, Diane Wernos, was only a teenager when Aileen was born. By the time Aileen was 4 years old, her mother abandoned her and her older brother Keith, leaving them to be raised by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wernos. Life with her grandparents was far from safe or loving. Her grandmother struggled with alcoholism, and her grandfather was a violent man with a heavy hand. Aileen and her brother grew up in an environment where love was scarce and punishment was frequent. By the time she reached her early teens, Aileen was already displaying troubling behaviors. She began drinking, using drugs, and getting into fights. She also began engaging in sexual activity at an early age, often in exchange for cigarettes, food, or money. She was only 11 when she started doing this with boys in the neighborhood, and soon she was ostracized at school and branded with a cruel reputation. At the age of 14, Aileen became pregnant after being raped by a family friend. Her grandfather forced her to give birth in a home for unwed mothers, and the child was immediately put up for adoption. She never saw the baby. Shortly afterward, her grandmother died, and her grandfather kicked her out of the house. By the time she was 15, she was homeless, surviving by hitchhiking, stealing, and engaging in prostitution along highways and truck stops. These years hardened Aileen. She drifted across the country, living on the margins of society. She was arrested several times for disorderly conduct, theft, and sex work. In her 20s, she moved to Florida, where the climate and roadside culture suited her transient lifestyle. She lived mostly out of cheap motels, with little stability, relying on prostitution to survive. In 1976, Aileen married a 69-year-old man named Louis Fell, who was a wealthy yacht club president. The marriage lasted only a matter of weeks before it dissolved in chaos. Aileen was volatile and quick to anger. She fought with Fell and was arrested for assault. The marriage ended quickly, and she returned to her wandering existence. Her brother Keith died of cancer in 1976 as well, leaving her with no close family. She received a small life insurance payout from his death, which she quickly spent. Over the following decade, Aileen was arrested repeatedly for offenses ranging from armed robbery to car theft. Police knew her as a drifter who lived by her wits, scraping by through sex work, scams, and petty crime. She spent short stints in jail, but never stayed long in one place. Her life was a constant cycle of brief highs and crushing lows. By the late 1980s, she was living in Florida full-time, working the highways as a prostitute. It was there she met a woman named Tyria Moore, a hotel maid. The two began a romantic relationship, and Aileen became deeply attached to her. For the first time in her life, she felt she had someone who cared about her. The two moved in together, living in cheap motels and apartments, surviving on Eileen's earnings from prostitution. Aileen was fiercely protective of Tyria and wanted to provide for her, but their life together was built on unstable ground. In late 1989, Eileen's life took a darker turn. She began killing the men who picked her up. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner. In November 1989, he picked up Aileen on a highway. Later, she claimed he had raped and beaten her, and that she killed him in self-defense. His body was found in the woods with multiple gunshot wounds. His car was later discovered abandoned. Over the next year, Aileen killed at least 6 more men. They were Charles Carskadden, David Spears, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Each was shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol, and their bodies were dumped in wooded areas along highways. Their cars were stolen and sometimes abandoned or crashed. Aileen and Tyria were often seen driving the vehicles, which drew suspicion. The killings created fear across Florida as police struggled to identify a pattern. At first, the victims seemed unconnected, ranging in age and occupation. But ballistics evidence soon linked them together. Investigators realized a single female prostitute was likely involved. Witnesses reported seeing Aileen and Tyria together near several of the crime scenes. By late 1990, police had identified Aileen Wuornos as a suspect. They launched a manhunt, and in January 1991, Aileen was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County. Tyria, fearing prosecution, agreed to cooperate with authorities. She called Aileen while wired by police and persuaded her to confess. Aileen admitted to the killings, but insisted they were all in self-defense, that the men had tried to rape or harm her. Her trial began in 1992 for the murder of Richard Mallory. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded serial killer who preyed on men for money and cars. The defense argued that she was a traumatized woman who had been assaulted and was defending herself. But the evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched her gun to the murders. Witnesses placed her with the victims' vehicles, and her taped confession revealed contradictions. Aileen was convicted of Mallory's murder and sentenced to death. Over the next year, she was tried and convicted for several of the other murders, receiving 6 death sentences in total. She became one of the few women on Florida's death row, and the press quickly labeled her as the first female serial killer in modern American history. While in prison, Eileen's mental health deteriorated. She gave erratic interviews, sometimes expressing remorse, other times lashing out at the world. She accused prison staff of mistreating her and claimed conspiracies were being formed against her. She said she wanted to die, that she was tired of life and ready for execution. In October 2002, after more than a decade on death row, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her final words were haunting. She said she would be back like Independence Day with Jesus and the spaceship. Her statements reflected the troubled and paranoid state of her mind at the end. The aftermath of her case left a complicated legacy. Some saw her as a monster who killed innocent men in cold blood. Others viewed her as a tragic figure, a woman brutalized from childhood who lashed out violently in a world that had never shown her kindness. Her life and crimes inspired documentaries, books, and the Oscar-winning film Monster, which portrayed her story with stark brutality. The story of Aileen Wuornos is not just about murder. It is also about cycles of abuse, trauma, and survival. From her abandoned childhood to her violent adulthood, every stage of her life seemed marked by cruelty and despair. In the end, she became both victim and predator, a woman who never found peace and left behind a trail of destruction. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gain. The Gain family lived a life of isolation and dysfunction. His father, George, was an alcoholic who struggled to hold jobs, often working as a tanner or carpenter, but rarely staying employed for long. His mother, Augusta, was the dominant figure in the household. She was a strict, fanatically religious woman who instilled in her children a deep fear of sin, women, and the outside world. Augusta preached that the world was evil, filled with temptations of the flesh, and that women other than herself were instruments of sin and corruption. She raised Ed and his older brother Henry to believe that lust and desire were the work of the devil. Despite her cruelty and constant preaching, Ed adored his mother and saw her as the guiding force of his life. In 1914, the family moved to a small farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farm was isolated, away from town, and Augusta liked it that way. She wanted to keep her boys away from the corrupting influence of the outside world. Ed grew up with little social interaction. He attended school, but was shy, withdrawn, and often the target of bullies. He had a peculiar manner of speaking and an unusual laugh, which made him stand out. His teachers noted that while he was quiet, he did fairly well academically, especially in reading. At home, Ed spent most of his time doing chores and listening to his mother's endless sermons. She read to him from the Bible, often focusing on passages about death, divine punishment, and the wickedness of women. This upbringing shaped Ed's worldview, blurring the lines between morality, sin, and obsession. As Ed grew into adolescence, his attachment to his mother deepened. He had almost no friends and no romantic relationships. He spent time reading pulp magazines about death, cannibals, and Nazi medical experiments. The grotesque fascinated him, and he began developing an unhealthy curiosity about the human body. In 1940, when Ed was 34, his father George died from heart failure, leaving Ed and Henry under the control of Augusta. The brothers worked odd jobs around town, often doing handyman tasks and farm work. Both were known as reliable workers, though Ed's strange mannerisms made him stand out. Henry, the older brother, eventually began to criticize Augusta's teachings and Ed's devotion to her. He worried about Ed's unhealthy attachment and often told friends that his brother's relationship with their mother was unnatural. In 1944, a mysterious event occurred. While the brothers were burning brush on the farm, the fire got out of control. Firefighters arrived, and when the blaze was put out, Ed claimed he had lost track of Henry. Later, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh. There were bruises on his head, and some suspected foul play, but the death was ruled as accidental. To this day, many believe Ed killed his brother to have his mother's love to himself. In 1945, tragedy struck again when Augusta suffered a series of strokes and died in December. Her death devastated Ed. She had been his entire world, and without her, he was utterly alone. He kept the farmhouse, but closed off most of the rooms, leaving them as shrines to his mother. He lived in a small area near the kitchen, surrounded by filth, decay, and growing madness. It was after his mother's death that Ed's behavior grew darker. He became fascinated with the idea of resurrection and the female body. He began visiting local cemeteries at night, exhuming the corpses of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother. He took their bodies home, dissected them, and used their skin and bones to create macabre trophies. Ed fashioned masks from human skin, belts made from nipples, bowls made from skulls, and even a suit of skin that he could wear. The small town of Plainfield had no idea of the horrors inside the Gain farmhouse. Ed remained a quiet but odd figure, sometimes babysitting local children, running errands, or doing handyman jobs. To many, he seemed harmless, just eccentric. That illusion shattered on November 16, 1957. Bernice Wardens, the owner of a local hardware store, went missing. Her son, who was the deputy sheriff, discovered bloodstains in the store and realized something was terribly wrong. The last sales receipt in the register showed that Bernice had sold antifreeze to Ed Gain. Police went to the Gain farmhouse to question him. What they found inside became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. Inside the farmhouse, officers discovered Bernice Warden's body hanging upside down from the rafters. She had been shot with a rifle, decapitated and gutted like a deer. The scene shocked even the most hardened investigators. As they searched further, they uncovered Ed's gruesome collection. Chairs upholstered with human skin, masks made from faces, a lampshade made of flesh, boxes of bones, and clothing sewn from the remains of women. The farmhouse was a house of horrors, filled with evidence of years of grave robbing and murder. Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished in 1954. He admitted to exhuming numerous graves, stealing bodies, and experimenting with their remains. He said he wanted to create a suit of skin to become his mother, believing he could resurrect her spirit by wearing the flesh of other women. The public was horrified. The crimes of Ed Gein became national news, both for their grotesque nature and their psychological depth. The quiet, reclusive farmhand had been living in a nightmare world of death and delusion, right under the noses of his unsuspecting neighbors. Ed was declared legally insane and unfit for trial. He was committed to a mental institution where he remained for the rest of his life. Decades later, in 1968, he was found fit to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was convicted but found insane at the time of the crime and was again confined to psychiatric care. Ed Gein spent his remaining years in institutions, often described as a quiet, compliant patient. He died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77 from respiratory and heart failure due to cancer. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, not far from the graves he had once disturbed. The legacy of Ed Gein lived on long after his death. His crimes inspired some of the most famous fictional killers in American culture, from Norman Bates in Psycho to Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. The story of the Butcher of Plainfield continues to haunt true crime history, a chilling reminder of how isolation, obsession, and madness can breed horrors that defy imagination. Next story. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9th of 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of four brothers. His parents, William and Dorothea Rader, both worked long hours, leaving Dennis and his siblings often unattended. From an early age, Dennis felt neglected and unnoticed, something he would later point to as a seed for his need for control and recognition. As a boy, he developed disturbing habits. He tortured and killed small animals in secret, deriving a sense of power from their suffering. He also developed violent sexual fantasies, imagining women bound and helpless. These fantasies would grow more elaborate as he aged, laying the foundation for his crimes. Rader attended Riverview Elementary and later Wichita Heights High School. He was quiet, average in grades, and never stood out much. His peers recalled him as somewhat strange, withdrawn, and socially awkward. After graduation in 1963, he drifted through a few years of college, then enlisted in the Air Force, where he served until 1970. He was stationed overseas and later returned home with an honorable discharge. On the surface, he had matured into a disciplined man, but his secret fantasies had only deepened. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz, a woman from Kansas. Together, they built a seemingly normal suburban life. Rader worked various jobs, studied criminal justice at Wichita State University, and was active in his church. Neighbors saw him as responsible, even dull, a man who kept his lawn tidy and waved politely. What no one knew was that Rader had begun to live a double life. On January 15th of 1974, Dennis Rader carried out his first known murders. He targeted the Otero family in Wichita. That morning, he broke into their home armed with a pistol and his so-called hit kit, a collection of ropes, cords, and tools he had assembled. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children Joseph Jr. and Josephine. Rader bound them with cords, tightening control as he went. He strangled Joseph and Julie, then their son. Finally, he hanged Josephine from a basement pipe, later admitting that he derived sexual gratification from her death. When he left, 4 members of the Otero family lay dead. Their bodies were discovered by the 2 older Otero children when they returned from school. The murders shocked Wichita and launched an investigation, but no suspects were identified. Rader craved recognition. In the months after the Otero killings, he sent a letter to a local newspaper describing the crime in detail and taunting police for their failure to catch him. In the letter, he gave himself a name, BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. The name would become forever linked to his reign of terror. Over the next several years, Rader killed again. In April of 1974, he murdered Catherine Bright, a young woman he had followed. He broke into her home, attacked her and her brother, and stabbed Catherine multiple times. Her brother barely survived. In 1977, he killed Shirley Vian, a mother of 3, after breaking into her home while her children were present. Later that year, he murdered Nancy Fox, binding and strangling her in her home. With each crime, he grew bolder, sending letters to police and media that detailed his fantasies and mocked the investigation. His communications often included cryptic drawings, poems, and codes, as though he were playing a twisted game. Despite the brutality of the murders, Rader was careful. He wore gloves, planned his attacks, and chose victims after stalking them. He referred to them as projects, reducing human lives to objects for his gratification. For police, the lack of clear evidence and the randomness of victims made the case difficult. Wichita lived in fear. Women checked their locks constantly, and rumors spread about the faceless killer who seemed to strike at will. In 1985, after several years of silence, BTK resurfaced with the murder of Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived only a few houses away from Rader. He broke into her home, strangled her, and then transported her body to his church, where he posed her in disturbing ways before discarding her in the countryside. This act showed how his fantasies and his public life were intertwined in ways no one could imagine. Rader continued killing into the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1986, he murdered Vicki Wegerle, strangling her in her home and photographing her body. In 1991, his final known victim, Dolores Davis, was abducted from her home, killed, and hidden beneath a bridge. After this, Rader appeared to stop killing, focusing instead on his family, career, and church duties. By the 1990s, the BTK case had gone cold. Police had files of letters, crime scene evidence, and victim accounts, but no suspect. Rader blended seamlessly into society. He became a compliance officer in Park City, enforcing local codes with strictness that annoyed many residents. He was also president of his church council, deeply involved in community affairs. To all appearances, he was a model citizen. Behind the mask, he continued to indulge in his fantasies, dressing in women's clothing, binding himself with ropes, and taking photographs of himself in elaborate poses meant to recreate the murders. The break in the case came not from police detective work alone, but from Rader's own arrogance. In 2004, after years of silence, he began sending letters again. He craved the attention he once had and wanted credit for his crimes. He mailed packages to local media, including a floppy disk with a message. Rader believed he had erased all traces of identity from the disk, but digital forensics revealed otherwise. Metadata on the file led police directly to the Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, where the file had been saved under the name Dennis. Investigators quickly connected Dennis Rader, the church council president, to the BTK case. Rader was placed under surveillance, and DNA obtained from his daughter's medical records matched DNA found at BTK crime scenes. In February 2005, after more than 30 years of mystery, Dennis Rader was arrested. The arrest shocked the community. People who had known him for decades could not believe that the polite churchman and strict code enforcer was the same person who had terrorized Wichita. Rader confessed in chilling detail, describing each murder as though he were recounting a work project. He showed no remorse, instead speaking matter-of-factly about how he stalked, bound, and killed his victims. He explained that he was driven by an alter ego he called Factor X, a dark force that compelled him. In court, Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. During his sentencing in August 2005, he gave a long statement describing each crime, again in detached detail. Family members of the victims wept as they listened. The judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. Rader was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he remains to this day. The case of the BTK killer stands as one of the most disturbing examples of a double life in criminal history. For 30 years, Dennis Rader was a husband, father, church leader, and community official. At the same time, he was a sadistic murderer who bound, tortured, and killed 10 people, reveling in the terror he caused. His arrogance in seeking attention ultimately led to his capture, ending decades of fear in Wichita. The story of BTK is a reminder of the masks people can wear and of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. David Berkowitz entered the world on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. He was born as Richard David Falco, the illegitimate child of Elizabeth Broder and Joseph Kleinman. His father was already married to another woman, and his mother was struggling financially and emotionally. Within just a few days of his birth, she gave him up for adoption. The infant boy was taken in by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-class Jewish couple who lived in the Bronx. They renamed him David Richard Berkowitz. For the first years of his life, it seemed like he would grow up in a stable home. His adoptive parents doted on him, but inside, David carried feelings of abandonment that would never go away. Growing up, David was restless and troubled. He had difficulty concentrating in school, often lashed out at other children, and developed an early fascination with destruction. One of the first signs of his darker impulses was his obsession with fire. Even as a child, he was caught setting small fires in trash cans and vacant lots. The thrill of watching flames spread gave him a sense of power and control. As he grew older, this obsession escalated. Investigators later discovered that during his adolescence, he may have set more than 1,000 separate fires across New York City, meticulously documenting them in notebooks. This compulsion foreshadowed the compulsive violence that would later define his adult life. Tragedy struck when David was just 14. His adoptive mother, Pearl, who had been the center of his emotional world, died of breast cancer. The loss shattered him. His father, Nathan, soon remarried, but David rejected his stepmother. The home felt cold, and the teenager spiraled further into isolation. He became angry, rebellious, and distant. He wandered the streets late at night, broke into houses, vandalized property, and nurtured violent fantasies. Teachers described him as disruptive and emotionally unstable. Neighbors noticed his odd behavior and tendency to lash out unpredictably. David began to feel like an outsider, unwanted in school, unwanted at home, and fundamentally disconnected from everyone around him. At 18, desperate for structure and a new sense of identity, David enlisted in the United States Army. Military life gave him discipline and routine, and he trained as a marksman, learning to handle firearms with precision. He was stationed in South Korea during his service, where he became proficient with rifles and pistols. But despite the opportunities to build camaraderie, David remained withdrawn. He struggled to form friendships and continued to feel like an outcast. In 1974, after 3 years of service, he was honorably discharged and returned to New York City. Back in civilian life, David worked a series of low-paying jobs, including security guard positions and later as a postal worker. He lived alone in Yonkers, and his mental state began to unravel. He developed strange fixations and paranoid delusions. One of the most disturbing centered on his neighbor Sam Carr, a man who owned a black Labrador retriever. David became convinced that the dog was possessed by a demon and was transmitting orders from Satan, commanding him to kill. The delusion grew more elaborate until David believed he was the soldier of a vast satanic network. By 1976, these thoughts became unbearable, and he decided to act on them. The killing spree began on Christmas Eve of 1975. David attacked 2 young women, stabbing them in Co-op City in the Bronx. Both survived, but the assaults gave him his first taste of the violence he craved. Months later, he escalated to gunfire. On July 29, 1976, he approached 2 women sitting in a parked car in the Bronx, Donna Loria and Jody Valenti. Without warning, he pulled out a .44 caliber revolver and fired. Donna was killed instantly, and Jody was wounded. The brutality shocked the neighborhood, but at first, police considered it an isolated act. Over the next year, the shootings continued. On October 23, 1976, Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan were attacked while sitting in a car in Queens. Both survived, though Carl was seriously injured. In November, high school students Donna DeMazy and Joan Lomino were shot in Queens. Donna was wounded, and Joan was left permanently paralyzed. On January 30th, 1977, David struck again, killing Christine Freund as she sat in a car with her fiancé, John Deal. The randomness of the attacks terrified New Yorkers. The killer seemed to target young women with long brown hair, often couples sitting in parked cars late at night. As the months went by, the list of victims grew. In March, Virginia Voskerikian, a 20-year-old student, was gunned down on her way home from class. In April, Valentina Suriani and her boyfriend Alexander Esau were shot in the Bronx. Both died from their wounds. By this point, police began to suspect that a single gunman was behind the series of attacks. Ballistic tests revealed that the bullets came from the same .44 caliber revolver. Newspapers seized on the story, and panic spread throughout the city. Women died or cut their hair to avoid fitting the killer's apparent preference. Couples avoided parking in lovers' lanes. Nightlife across the boroughs slowed. The fear of the unknown gunman seeped into daily life. David Berkowitz, meanwhile, reveled in the attention. He wrote taunting letters to the police and the press, signing himself as the Son of Sam. In these rambling notes, he described himself as a monster under the command of a demonic father figure. The letters were published in newspapers, and his words fueled hysteria. He enjoyed watching the city tremble. The killings continued into the summer of 1977. In June, Judy Placido and Salvatore Lupo were shot in Queens after leaving a nightclub, though both survived. On July 31st, David carried out his final attack, killing 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz and blinding her date, Robert Violante, in Brooklyn. It was this attack that ultimately led to his capture. Witnesses reported seeing a man near the crime scene, carrying something under his arm. A woman noticed a suspicious figure tearing up a parking ticket on his car near the shooting site. Investigators traced the ticket to a Ford Galaxy registered to David Berkowitz in Yonkers. On August 10, 1977, police surrounded his apartment building. Inside his car, they found a rifle, maps of past crime scenes, and a letter threatening future attacks. When they knocked on his door, David reportedly greeted them calmly, saying, "You got me." In custody, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He claimed that he was obeying commands from a demon who spoke through Sam Carr's dog. Although these claims raised questions about his sanity, he was declared competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, David pled guilty to 6 murders and was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison. Behind bars, Berkowitz initially embraced his notoriety. He gave interviews and fueled myths about his involvement in satanic cults. In the late 1980s, he claimed to have undergone a religious conversion, declaring himself a born-again Christian. Over the decades, he has remained in prison, occasionally speaking to the media, but never leaving the confines of his cell. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, sent the sum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy, a student at the University of Washington, who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, 2 women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims, often at night, assaulted them, and killed them, usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remained. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remain the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a lover's lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27th, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near miss, the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in, and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac Killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, Lianyu, outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community was small, neighbors knew one another, and farms stretched across the flat landscape. Yet behind this peaceful setting there lived a man whose crimes would eventually horrify the entire nation. His name was Edward Theodore Gain. Ed Gain was born in August 1906 to George and Augusta Gain. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work. while his mother was deeply religious, domineering, and strict. Augusta instilled in her two sons a belief that the world was filled with sin and corruption. She particularly warned them against women, describing them as instruments of immorality. Ed grew up isolated. The family rarely allowed social interaction, and the Gain children were discouraged from making friends. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and awkward. He was ridiculed by other children at school, which only pushed him further into isolation. His mother's teachings shaped him profoundly. He developed an unhealthy attachment to Augusta, viewing her as the only pure and trustworthy person in the world. This dependence would define his entire life. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving the family to survive on farm income. Soon after, his older brother Henry began expressing doubts about their mother's strict worldview. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, but in 1944 Henry died in a suspicious fire while working on the family property. Although the official cause was listed as asphyxiation, investigators quietly noted that the circumstances were odd. Ed reported the fire, and when Henry's body was found, it appeared not badly burned, leading some to wonder if Ed had played a role in his brother's death. After Henry's passing, Ed was left alone with his mother. But only a year later, in 1945, Augusta herself died following a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed. He had lost the one person who dominated his world and provided structure to his life. Without her guidance, he became reclusive, retreating into the farmhouse that grew increasingly filthy and cluttered. Most rooms were left untouched as shrines to Augusta, kept exactly as she had left them, while Ed confined himself to a few areas filled with debris and decay. It was in this lonely environment that Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to take its most disturbing form. He frequently visited cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried bodies. He removed skin, bones, and organs, taking them back to his farmhouse where he fashioned grotesque trophies. Investigators later discovered masks made of human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, and furniture upholstered with human hides. These creations suggested that Ed was attempting to recreate his mother's presence or even become her by wearing the skin of women he exhumed. For many years, his macabre activities went unnoticed. Plainfield was a small, trusting community, and Ed was seen as odd but harmless. He worked odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and was known for being polite though strange. That perception changed in November 1957 when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her store was found locked with bloodstains on the floor. A receipt showed that Ed Gain had been her last customer that day. Police obtained a search warrant and went to Ed's farmhouse. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. Inside the house were the remains of Bernice Wardens. Her body had been hung in a shed and gutted like a deer. As investigators searched further, they uncovered the horrific collection of human remains Ed had gathered over the years. Masks of human faces hung on the walls. Chairs were covered in human skin, and boxes contained organs. Some remains were traced back to missing women, though Ed admitted many came from graves he had robbed. The discoveries horrified the public. The idea that a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been committing such grotesque acts shattered the sense of safety in small-town America. Newspapers across the country printed the details, and Ed Gain quickly became infamous. His crimes went beyond murder into a realm of depravity rarely seen. During interrogation, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. He also admitted to robbing graves, but claimed he had not killed most of the women whose remains were found in his house. His statements revealed a disturbed mind. He described entering trances when digging up bodies, and he explained how he crafted clothing and masks in an effort to transform himself into his mother. In 1958, Ed Gain was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric institution. For more than a decade, he remained there until doctors declared him fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but insane, leading to his return to a mental hospital where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. The case of Ed Gein left a lasting legacy not only in true crime history, but also in popular culture. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. His story raised questions about mental illness, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. For the people of Plainfield, the scars never fully healed. The town became associated with darkness it never asked for. Many locals avoided speaking about Ed Gein for decades, wishing to move past the horror. Yet the farmhouse where he committed his crimes became a site of morbid curiosity until it was eventually burned down. Ed Gein remains a figure of fascination because his crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. He was not the typical killer driven by greed or impulse. Instead, he was a man shaped by isolation, dominated by his mother, and consumed by fantasies that grew more grotesque after her death. His actions shock a nation because they revealed what can emerge from loneliness and obsession left unchecked. Even today, his story is studied in criminal psychology as an example of how trauma, control, and mental illness can twist a life into something almost unimaginable. Behind every horror film inspired by his deeds is the reminder that these terrors were once real in a small Wisconsin town where people thought they knew their neighbors. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire Police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murders seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens. and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and 2 of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves.